Well, good evening, everyone. I'll call our evening to order with a warm word of welcome first to Jana and the Katz family, the honor you've given us of being here. I'm Tom Treva, the co-director with my colleague Eugenio Chang Rodriguez of the University Seminar on Latin America. We are one of a number of hosts pleased and proud to pay tribute to Friedrich Katz this evening. Our co-sponsors would include the Center for the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago and El Colegio de Mexico, and our own Institute of Latin American Studies here at the university. All proud and pleased to be here, and our hearts go out. We share the loss, and we hope in this evening's events we can bring to life Friedrich, who I think knows about this and is somehow is happy and pleased that we're all gathered here this evening. So on behalf of the University Seminar, it's just my job to get things underway. We've got a busy program for you this evening. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Dean of our School of International Public Affairs, John Coatsworth, who will speak next. Welcome, John.
I will also be brief. I want to say thank you to the Institute for Latin American Studies here at Columbia, to the university seminars, and especially to the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago for making this evening possible. Originally, we had planned this evening as, in a sense, a book launch. You'll hear about the book shortly, a book published by the Colegio de Mexico and Editorial Era, the publishers of Friedrich's most notable books in Mexico. We were not able to do it in Chicago because Friedrich this past summer was too sick to travel by air, but his plan was to be present with us this evening, and in some ways I think he already is. Not only are the members of his family here, with some more on their way from the train station, who will be arriving shortly, but I see in this audience a number of students who went to the University of Chicago to study with Friedrich, including Mark Wasserman, who was the first PhD awarded in the Katz era at the University of Chicago, and a number of others who were here who studied with Friedrich. Friedrich once did me the honor of claiming, I never believed it, that he'd received a number of letters while we were both at Chicago addressed to Professor Katzworth. We shared adjoining offices for 21 years, from the time that Friedrich arrived in Chicago in the fall of 1971 to 1993, which was my last year at the University of Chicago. During that time, for at least a decade and a half, 10% or more of all of the dissertations, all of the PhDs awarded in Latin American history in the United States were awarded at the University of Chicago. And most of them turned out to be historians of really considerable note, many of whom are in this room this evening. It was an amazing period of time for me. Friedrich was my friend, my mentor. He even chaired the tenure committee that decided to award me tenure after a period of nervousness. I'm sure without his political skills honed in various parts of the world, his success would have been, my tenure would have been in deep jeopardy. I've published as the first chapter of the book that you'll hear a bit about, Semblanza, or a portrait of Friedrich Katz, as a friend and as an intellectual, so I won't take time this evening. I will just say that it was one of the high points of my life to have known this man. He was a terrific person. I never figured out why he was so attracted to Pancho Villa, because his personality was so opposed, so opposite. But he was a wonderful person, and it's terrific that you're all here to remember him this evening. Thank you very much. Emilio.
Thank you, John. Well, as John said, the purpose of this event was originally a very different one. And I remember distinctly, I think it was in June in Philadelphia when I went to visit Friedrich that we came up with the idea, he and I together, of doing this book launch here in New York, bringing all his friends, having an opportunity to celebrate what has turned out to be, as I hope many of you will see, really truly a fabulous book in both intellectual or academic terms, but also as a labor of love from his friends and colleagues and students. The book is here. Our friends from ERA in Mexico did us a very kind favor of bringing a number of them and making them available should any of you want to purchase it afterwards or look at it. And indeed I think the size of it, not quite as big as the Pancho Villa book, but close, is a small measure of not only the affection but the admiration that all of us had for him. And so the event has turned out to be, unfortunately, a very different thing from what we had planned. But so all I have to say here now is a number of words of thanks, as you heard before, to our friends from Colombia, who really took this on very kindly and very generously so we could do an event here in New York that Friedrich could attend. It was not to be, but nevertheless, here we are. I should also mention, because it's very important and it has a lot to do with all of our friends here, that in the nearly 40 years that Professor Katz taught at the University of Chicago, one of the most distinctive aspects of the program there was the very vibrant presence, constant presence, I would say, of Mexican historians, intellectuals, scholars, many of whom, all of whom were invited by Friedrich and also by John and later by Claudio Lomnitz. And a good number of them, in fact, 4 of the people you'll hear from today actually came to the university as thanks to the generosity of the Tinker Foundation as Tinker visiting professors. And so being here in New York, we do want to acknowledge the role that the Tinker Foundation had in thanking us. I could go on for hours. I have a long list. I've given Yana a long list of, a long pile of letters we've received from friends, from colleagues, from Mexican institutions. I want to acknowledge our friends here from the Instituto Mora who have come from Mexico to be present here today and want to express their condolences to the Katz family and to all of us who feel the loss. And the list is, in that respect, endless. I want to single out, however, for a special thanks, and we also have the fortune of having him here, Marcelo Uribe from Ediciones ERA, who took on what was an unwieldy and massive number of essays, distinguished many of them, but yet, in need of work, and in a very brief period of time, pulled together what I think you'll all agree is really a beautiful, outstanding work that will be a lasting testimony to not only the affection that we all had for him, but most of all, his profound intellectual influence. Thank you, Marcelo. ERA, as many of you know, was Friedrich's publisher in Mexico, and with this last book, they really have done him an extraordinary honor, and we are very grateful. We are very grateful for that. You'll hear in the next few minutes. First, the co-editor of the book, Javier Garcia Diego, speak a little about how the book came together, which is itself, I think, a testimony to Friedrich's broad international influence. And then we asked 4 very distinguished scholars who also happen to be among Friedrich's dearest friends to speak on the 4 foundational sections of the book. Now, given, of course, the sad change in the nature of this event, they were sort of released from their strict obligation to speak specifically and only about the essays in the book, of which there are many, and allowed to mix that with whatever other personal reflections they wanted to share with us. And then finally, and for this we're also very grateful, Friedrich and Jana's children, Leo Katz and Jacqueline Ross, have agreed to speak to us on behalf of the family. At the end of that, we'll have a very small reception, hopefully, so we can talk to each other and share all the good memories we have of this great friend and scholar. So with that, I thank you all for coming, and ask our friend Javier Garcia Diego to come forward. Yeah.
Buenas noches. He preparado unas palabras que me encantaría decir en mi idioma, but I was asked to do it in English. So I'll do it in my English. The presentation of a book in homage to a colleague is usually a most happy occasion, both for the person to whom the tribute is paid and for the fellow colleagues and disciples who come together for that tribute. But, as the saying goes, the exception proves the rule. Today's presentation of the book Revolution and Exile in Mexico in Mexican History, Homage to Friedrich Katz, alas, is not a joyous time. His irreparable passing is still a very fresh wound in our minds and hearts, far too recent to heal. A little over a year ago, Emilio Curi and I learned that our beloved Professor Katz was ill. Along with other disciples and colleagues of his, we decided to publish a book in his honor. It appeared that selecting the authors, inviting them, waiting for their contributions, and editing and publishing the book was to turn into an extremely long process, taking much more time than that available to us. So we decided to prepare this book in homage to Professor Katz using material from 3 colloquiums that had already been held. 2 at the University of Chicago and 1 in Friedrich Katz's life and works had been the common thread. The theme of the first colloquium, which took place in Chicago in October 2002, consisted of the different groups of exiles who had arrived in Mexico in the second third of the 20th century. Katz himself had chosen that subject, which was a decisive feature of his own biography, and also selected the participants. The second one was held once again in Chicago in the year 2007 to celebrate his 80th birthday. The theme was agrarian issues in the Mexican Revolution, and once again, Professor Katz participated in the selection of the subjects and the speakers. The third one was held that same year for the same purpose, to celebrate the fact that he had turned 80. But this time it took place in Mexico City, where several of his friends, colleagues, and students took part. Compiling the papers from these 3 colloquiums was a wise decision for several different reasons. Firstly, these themes were preeminent in Katz's academic life. Secondly, in one way or another, the authors had been chosen by Katz himself. And in the third place, we already had a text of most of the papers, for which reason it would not be necessary to wait a long time while the contributions were being written. Almost all of the papers had been prepared ahead of time before they were delivered in the respective colloquiums. For Emilio Curi and me, choosing a publisher for this book posed no dilemma. For works in Spanish, Katz only used the publishing house Ediciones Era, which immediately agreed to produce the book with no qualms regarding either in its length or cost. For Era, Katz was more than just a successful author. Rather, he was a friend and a hallmark of the company. This obvious decision turned out to be very wise indeed, for the book is absolutely splendid, with a magnificent design and layout, and a most beautiful cover, glazed by a portrait of the Katz we all wish to remember, a man with an intelligent gaze and huge smile, Katz still vividly alive. Thus, it appeared that the book would have a favorable outcome in all senses. The authors involved agreed to promptly refine and round out their papers, ensuring they were in keeping with this tribute. Compiling the papers was an easy task. Some were historiographical reviews of Katz's life and works. Others dealt with the Mexican Revolution in general, although it was evident that agrarian issues were foremost, and still others focused specifically on the revolution in northern Mexico, particularly on Pancho Villa. A last group of papers was devoted to the theme of exiles in Mexico in the 20th century, ranging from Russian, Central European, and Spanish exiles in the 1930s to South American ones in the 70s. Similarly, selecting a subtitle presented no problem, for it was obvious that we should use a variation of Edmundo O'Gorman's well-known phrase on a historian's love for his fatherland, in this case, his adopted homeland, because Mexico was just that for Friedrich Katz, not a mere topic to be studied, but an authentic adopted fatherland which a person can come to cherish just as much as the native one. Hence, Katz's commitment to the history of Mexico, and hence the extraordinary quality of his works, are a result not only of scientific inquiry, but also of his love for Mexico. The book's great length, with a total of 45 contributions, confirms another of Katz's traits. He was much beloved by all of us who had the privilege of knowing him, both as his colleagues and students, due to his incomparable humanness. His generosity was only matched by his kindness, courtesy, and refinement. We could say that in his work, Katz combined three historical perspectives: global, national, and regional, and he applied that historiographical principle to his relationship with his peers, attending to the requests and needs of Mexican historians as those of other nationalities, and respecting professional historians and local chroniclers, all on an equal basis. Most probably, I was the only person responsible for Friedrich Katz's not seeing this work come to light, although he received updates from Emilio Curi regarding the book, its content, and its preparation. In effect, without a doubt, the time taken in this book's production can be attributed to a delay on my part at some point. The book was finally in print this past October 13th, a Wednesday, and he was sent a copy the following day, on Thursday. Unfortunately, I have been told that the book reached his home on Saturday, October 16th, just a few hours after his death. Our intention was for the book to be presented in Mexico during the 13ª Reunión de Historiadores de México, Estados Unidos y Canadá, where he was to be the honorary chairman, a distinction he more than deserved, for no one was more suited to preside over a colloquium in which one of the major themes was the Mexican Revolution, especially now in 2010 on its 100th anniversary. He reacted to this appointment with great joy and humility. As for the United States, plans were made to present the book here today at Columbia University in New York, to which he could travel from Philadelphia, where he was receiving medical treatment. He planned to attend both events, joining us in this celebration. However, his illness did not allow him to do so, nor to see the book in print. Nevertheless, we can say that Katz's spirit is with us here today. We can also affirm that his works will always be with us, as well as our fond memories of his incredible kind-heartedness. Thank you very much.
Dear family and friends of our admired colleague Friedrich Katz, let my first words go to the Katz family, with whom my king and I had wonderful moments on different periods of our lives. Jana, this gentle and strong, bright and sensible woman, a successful pediatrician, was his long life partner. In a recent conversation, she told me that she has no bad memories of Friedel, and that is a lot to say of her husband with whom she shared more than 50 years. Jana's pain, who will have to reconstruct her life surrounded by unforgettable memories, is shared by me. To Leo, the oldest son, bearer of his grandfather's name, distinguished university professor and author, and who has various relationships with his father as a child and as a grown-up man, relationships which are never simple for anybody, and showed great love and a nobility of character. To Jackie, who had the appearance of a Viennese princess since childhood, but chose to be a tough prosecutor for some years, and now a distinguished professor. Jackie always gave the love and the tenderness one awaits from a daughter, and whose most recent commentary was qualified his father as the best of all. And to his grandchildren too, who will miss him dearly, I know. To their grief, I add my own and that of Margarita, my wife. I felt the sorrow that an old comrade has for the death of his best friend, with whom he has shared dangers, ideas, work, and days filled with intimacy, gratefulness, agreements, and disagreements too. Ever since our teenage, I will not repeat the authorized a very interesting information and appraisal of the life and works of Friedrich Katz that the authors of the first chapter of Revolución y Exilio en la Historia de México have given us. Only I will say that they all contribute to complete the picture of Friedrich Katz. It is not until now that I fully realize what bonded us together, and now leaves such a great emptiness in my life. Katz and I were from the same generation of survivors that Amos Oz described so well in his novel A Tale of Love and Darkness. Ours is a friendship based on shared dramatic experiences, on the confrontation with them and the will to mentally and physically overcome, never losing hope of a better world. My first encounter with him was that of two refugee teenagers. He had already escaped death and come to Mexico in 1940, having been expelled. He was a small boy from Germany, France, and the United States. I had arrived in the San Tomé ship from Lisbon after being expelled from Bulgaria and 2-year precarious stay in France. My father, my mother, and I left Marseille on June 1942. 4 months later, the Germans invaded the non-occupied France, including the city. That is to say, we came out of there 4 months before certain death. The exiled child has a special sensitivity. We weren't like all other children. Friedrich and myself marveled at the serenity, the capability to enjoy the present day without asking questions about the future, about what may happen tomorrow, of the Mexican middle-class kids with whom we were in contact. How did the encounter come to be? I was a member of a Zionist socialist organization whose name is Hashomer Atzair, the Young Guard. The purpose of this movement was to create in Israel equalitarian agricultural communes where everybody engaged in physical work and struggled for the socialist Israel. The young Friedel was the son of a communist militant family. But his mother, as Womack has reminded us in his work, in her early youth had been a member of the Hashomer Atzair. His parents decided that for the time being he could participate in the Mexican Hashomer Atzair, and that was how my friend came to a summer camp in the year of 1948 with his accordion, on which he would mainly play revolutionary songs of the Spanish Civil War. Los Cuatro Generales, Viva la Quinta Brigada, and so on and so on. We rapidly became very close, even though I was 3 years younger. We shared the same passion for reading, and we were both inclined to controversy. The themes were Marxism, socialism, and the destiny of the Jewish people who had recently been through the Holocaust, from which we were both survivors. Katz was then 19 years old, and he had been brought up in the atmosphere of the Mitteleuropa Jewish libertarian tradition, to which George Lukács, Erich Fromm, Walter Benjamin, Franz Kafka, Martin Buber, and later Erich Hobsbawm, among others, belong. I was the son of a middle-class Bulgarian family in which there was some knowledge and admiration for that culture. Friedrich had been educated between a family that spoke Yiddish, and I was from a Sephardic family that spoke Judaism, that is, Old Spanish. His father was originally from Romania, and my father was from Ruse, or Ruchuk, as it was called under the Ottoman Empire, a city on the Danube which looked over to Romania. The coincidences were many, and they would follow us through our whole life. My friend was a Marxist, and I was an apprentice of Marxism, mesmerized by his rich background. He was a socialist, and so was I, although different from my micro-socialism, it did not exclude it, possibly because of his mother past, and perhaps because Hashomer Atzair was born in Vienna too, as part of this libertarian Jewish tradition. For both of us, Mexico meant life, meant freedom after a hazardous and dangerous past. Each one followed then his own path. I stayed in Mexico, became a citizen at the age of 21, and had my first academic and political experiences in the country. On the other hand, Friedrich went back to Europe and had quite a different itinerary. But destiny would reunite us again. Attracted by socialism and a strong posture against anti-Semitism, he went to the German Democratic Republic in 1956 to finish his studies and begin an academic career which he could not accomplish in Austria, where there was still a very strong anti-Semitic mindset. He would remain there for 14 years. In 1967, President Díaz Ordaz decided to reunite us again. He initiated a preventive witch hunt against some intellectual of which I became a victim too. After a series of hostile attacks from the police, I was confronted with the impossibility of continuing my academic work and ended up leaving to the country with a scholarship from where? From the German Democratic Republic. Studying German in Leipzig, I was told that my friend of the teenage years was already a Herr Professor at the Humboldt University. I met Katz in Berlin, and once again that same clique that from past years produced itself. But now he was married to the beautiful Viennese and had 2 children, with whom my family soon bonded with and started a friendship. I have no words. I have no words to express the way in which Friedel and Jana received the political exile that had arrived to an unknown country. With the passing of the days, I felt taken care of, oriented, and supported by them with unbound generosity. In my case, Katz greatly shaped my future. Initially, I planned to study at the Superior School of Political Economy. Friedel convinced me to go to the Department of History of the Humboldt University, in which he himself worked as a professor. How he managed it, I still don't know. Looking backwards, I now see how Katz influenced my development. For the School of Political Economy reigned in an absolute dogmatism, whereas the group to which Katz introduced me to, and which was mainly made of Manfred Kosok and 3 other friends, there was an ambience of openness, of free thinking, despite official censorship. Once again, we began an active exchange of ideas. Now the theme was the GDR and the real existence or the real non-existence of socialism. We both discovered that our train of thought had evolved according to the paradigm that in change of times there is a calling for vigorous change in ideas. That is a principle that was Katz's principle, and it is mine too. It was a frenetic trip of comings and goings between hard reality and the possibility of a better future. Although a young state, that GDR looked like that first scene from the movie El Gato Pardo, how to say in English, where there is a row of old men and women sitting in the church covered with the dust of the Sicilian summer. They did not understand that without democracy, socialism is impossible. 1968 changed everything. Both of us supported the struggle of the Mexican students and rejected the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. We both came in different ways in conflict with the GDR government. He resigned and left in 1970. I did it a year later. Again, we were survivors. I tried to synthesize his personal contribution to the Mexican historiography. I would distinguish only two. There is in him, in Friedrich Katz, some of the best legacy of von Ranke, the necessity of knowing what and how things really happened. In his opus magnum, The Life and Times of Pancho Villa, there is a great battle to distinguish reality from myth. And Villa, before Katz's book, more than any other revolutionary, was an immense tapestry of myths, legends, and wishful thinking. Only comparable to the pre-Hispanic gods and their ghastly enemies. Many times his search has to do with his relentless quest for scientific truth. Submerged in Mexico in a sea of myth, Katz, more than anybody else, taught us the importance of rescuing Mexican history from myths and legends, ideology, and capricious interpretation. This purpose forced him to a gigantic and well-organized work. And he was asked every year, Friedel, is your book ready? And the years went by, and we said he will never finish. But then he looked over all the archives, all the sources, popular culture and art to be able to write. As he said in one of his last interviews, Villa haunted his dreams. There was this Viennese mind trying to understand the logic and the lack of logic of a northern Mexican bandit turned a shrewd revolutionary. But that was not enough. His courage to tackle his task included many other actors, hundreds. Slowly, the figure of the Mexican revolutionary at the beginning of the 20th century arises from the diversity which is in his book. To understand Mexico and to describe it beyond myths does not mean to ignore their immense force in Mexican culture. True to social history, he does not look for explanation of all the actions of the characters in the psychology of them. but frequently underlines the significance of economic and cultural conditions that are beyond the actor's consciousness. He writes biographies within the social historical frame in all of its complexity. And his method runs to all his voluminous work. In his two earlier books, Las relaciones socioeconómicas de los aztecas en los siglos XV y XVI and pre-Columbian cultures, Katz tries and generally succeeds to show that in spite of the qualitative differences between American, who was completely isolated from the world, antique cultures, and those of the old world, there are enough universal traits to insert them in a comparative, fruitful study. Somehow he was ahead of the new approach that now dominates this field. Another contribution to the writing and the understanding of Mexican history was to rescue it from its self-imposed nationalist isolation and alienation, and to place it in the world perspective. It is said that there are two kinds of relationship between an author and his books. In the first case, the writings are more valuable than the man himself. This does not diminish the value of the books. In the second case, the man behind the books has a life richer in humanism, in qualities, in generosity, and struggle for a better world than what his works reveal. And then there is a great man behind a great work, and this is the supreme achievement of a life endeavor. This is without doubt Friedrich Katz's case. He was a man of principles, a patient tutor of hundreds of students in 3 countries, a tireless promoter of relations between Mexican and North American scholars, and an even better family man. Maybe the essence of his personality is revealed through the attitude of children and young people towards Friedrich. A great example is the one of my own children. They all deeply were affected when they knew of Friedrich Katz's death. May this great man rest in peace, and may his work inspire new and valiant books, and may they ride through the world on horsebacks, Adidas Centauros del Norte forever. Thank you.
Forgive my accent. Para Yana, Leo, Jackie, and Miriam. It's 4 points. I'll tell the points. One, somewhere in the book presented today in homage to Friedrich Katz, Mauricio Tenorio mentions a historian who once asked, "And you, Friedrich, how do you most see yourself? As Mexican?" Thank you. That's good. As Mexican, German, or American? Concealing any irony with that gentle and measured tone of his, Friedrich answered that he was Austrian, not German, and that he loved Mexico, the country that had saved him and his family. However, he added, "If I must answer, I would say that I am a survivor, one of those who got out alive." His words came from deep inside. I would have liked to have asked Friedrich about the sense he made of his own history, like the sense he has searched for in the destiny of so many others. Another question I kept for myself. 2. We are gathered here to present the book Revolución y Exilio en la Historia de México, del amor de un historiador a su patria adoptiva, compiled by Javier García Diego and Emilio Curi and published by ERA. As Katz told us, the book is about a survivor's intense, searing, and desperate love. That may be why he was able to penetrate so deeply into the life of Mexico with his miner's pick and tracker's instinct. This book shows us one of Friedrich's greatest skills. This book, gathering his disciples and friends, different from one another, putting them to work together, though being apart from each other, and uniting around topics and tasks those of us who for many years were his constant disciples, whom he treated with unstinting and unfailing generosity and patience. I would like to recall now one among so many of his books, a masterful historical work that he compiled years ago, conducted and assembled with such talent that to me resembles a musical composition, Riot, Rebellion, and Revolution. You were there. One of the four parts of the book now being presented is a direct descendant of that book. It is titled Mexican Revolution, this part that you asked me to talk about. I will be short on this part. This section of the book provides a framework for understanding the whole volume and also reveals the intention behind the 12 essays appearing in this section. It is an interview, this part is an interview on the Mexican Revolution, where Friedrich answers the direct and terse questions posed by Emilio Curi. Katz explains how that dense and volatile plot in perpetual movement that is the Mexican state was woven during the 19th century and the Mexican Revolution, and how that process of relationships among human beings becomes, like the Greek man of antiquity told us, periodically torn apart and periodically rewoven into a new variation of its old self. The interview, this one, is a spoken text, like Katz used to work, made up of the 4 ingredients found in every historical narrative based on evidence and images: orderly exposition, explanatory power, logical coherence, and fluid rendition. Behind all this is a gaze, a way of seeing. Friedrich Katz's gaze, shaped by his life and studies, as you told us, aims first and foremost at unraveling the warp's threads, those threads that are not visible to the naked eye, and that come from the people, and give meaning to the fabric of history and material substance to their story, without forgetting or belittling the major figures on the stage. His gaze seems to be guided by the poem by Cesar Vallejo, the Peruvian poet who lived at the fall of the Spanish Republic. I quote, "Every brilliant action or voice comes from the people and moves towards it face on or transmitted by incessant beats by the pink smoke of bitter, luckless passwords." 3. The 12 essays on this volume that deal with the Mexican Revolution and its aftermath flow from the craft of the historian Friedrich Katz. All of us, the 45 historians who appear in this book, 45, are disciples of that craft. I will only briefly mention my colleagues who wrote on that topic because it was, I will only mention my colleagues who wrote on that topic, the Mexican Revolution, because it was one thing then when we still hoped to present this book in the presence of our teacher, and another thing altogether to talk now that is gone about him and the school he created. 6 of the essays delve into the revolution and its origins. Enrique Semo writes about the joint persistence of both the hacienda and the communal property. Claudio Lemnes digs into the archaeology of post-revolutionary Mexican nationalism. Mónica Blanco discovers rebellions where we had been told none existed. Antonio Saborit shows the comedy of errors being enacted behind the Decena Trágica, a topic, this period, the Decena Trágica, on which Friedrich was working this time. Josefina MacGregor explores the political truculence of Victoriano Huerta dictatorship. Pablo Yankelevich inquires into the significance of the clandestine acquisition of weapons in the forging of the new Mexican state. The clandestine acquisition of weapons for revolutions, by the way, was an occupation that also concerned Leo Katz, Friedrich's father. These are followed by 5 essays on the post-revolutionary period. Jan Meyer recounts, as if reciting Rubén Darío's The Wolf Reasons, what made the Cristero rebels move against the state and beyond the Catholic Church. Lorenzo Meyer, Alicia Hernandez, Daniel Spencer, and Alan Knight expose the complicated birth of a paternal corporative state, its authoritarianism established by Calles, its intertwined relation with the corporative unionism in the oil industry, and with Lombardo Toledano's statists and pro-Soviet unionism, and finally, the problems involved in using the European categories of the interwar period to define the Mexican political actors. An homage to our teacher. Their diversity is an incitement not to simplify, to first examine the reality of all those past without imposing in advance political categories and classifications, no matter how useful they might turn out to be afterwards as an explanatory tool. 4. There will be time to study and cover the broad and lasting influence Friedrich Katz has had in the transformation of the historiography of the Mexican Revolution. Today, I will only note that it was Katz's sensitivity and craft that allowed him to fix his sight on the great enigma of that revolution, the figure of Pancho Villa, to decipher and explain him. He was not the only one who did it, but he went deeper and with serenity. When facing the revolution of the North, he followed the old expression, not to laugh, not to cry, but to understand. He searched and gave us the key to understand a people made of men and women in constant movement who saw themselves reflected in Villa, impelling him forward and following him, those who rose up against the ancestral humiliations and dispossession, and who, with the stampede of their horses and cannon, ushered in the Mexico of the 20th century, even though others took over and enriched themselves afterwards. Friedrich's soul and gaze hail from far away. I am a survivor, one of those who got out alive, he said in response to the impertinent question. That soul and gaze were shaped by the familiar story of exile, separation, and expulsion, and with the awareness that he was one of the few who managed to escape the dreadful end of millions of other European Jews, the flower of the culture, the intellectually, the artisan crafts, and the arts of Middle Europe. Friedrich's gaze, like the gaze of Rosa Luxemburg, Walter Benjamin, and Franz Kafka, was the legacy of a culture that also knew persecution, humiliation, and dispossession, along with the proud arts of resistance, resurrection, and rebellion. Marx's ideas did not distance him from that legacy. Rather, they helped him to refine his depth and compassion. But I would say that it is Friedrich's life as a whole, the key that opened for him the door to delve into the major enigma of a revolution that violently, like as all the others, sought to put an end to the endless history of humiliation and contempt, and to open a time of equality, justice, and freedom. The one who survived is now back in Vienna. May each of us remain loyal to his teachings and find in our lives, study, and experience the key into history.
A few years ago, Elie Wiesel, reflecting on the reasons why one must remember, what can be worse than forgetfulness? The life of my memory is my own life. It is remembering that enables man to assert that time leaves imprints and scars on the surface of history, and that all events are interlinked just as human beings are. Without memory, nothing is possible. How can we ensure that it remains within history and acts upon it? I thank the University of Columbia, University of Chicago, and the Colegio de Mexico for giving me the opportunity precisely to remember my lifetime friend and teacher, Friedrich Katz, and to retrieve from memory experiences that I shared with him. In order to do this, I must go back to a now distant past when a series of events brought me close to him. Within my inner family circle, I have heard about the early, almost heroic days of such European refugees as Egon Erwin Kisch, Anna Segers, and the Katz family, of the political activism Bronia and Leo, the publishing work done by his father Leo for the Tribune Israelita, the Jewish Tribune, and his first touching effort to record the history of the Holocaust in a work entitled Totenjäger, Hunters of the Dead, which was published not only in Spanish, but also in Yiddish, the language in novel, by authors such as Homage, Isaac Peretz, and Sholem Aleichem. When I met Friedrich in the 1960s, a friendship that was to endure for the rest of our lives sprang up between us, based on the extraordinary fascination that he aroused in me, a historian at the beginning of my career. This wasn't just due to his prodigious knowledge of Mexican history or his solid theoretical methodological training, but went much further, extending to the tone of voice when expressing ideas, his steadfast generosity, his acuteness on certain topics, and above all, his incredible ability to always see positive ends of everything and everybody, not to mention the contagious enthusiasm and the conviction with which he always vehemently defended the ideological, political, and social beliefs. Our long walks on the campus at the University of Texas in Austin, our conversations whenever he visited Mexico, and our exploits flying across the state of Chihuahua in a tiny, tiny Mexican Air Force plane gradually deepened cemented the close friendship that linked me to this man who was meant so much both to me personally and to the contemporary Mexican historiography. As a Mexican, I thank him for his love, his loyalty, and his abiding gratitude to my country, which, as he always asserted, saved the lives of his family and himself. Friedrich was just 13 years old when he arrived in Mexico, and there can be no doubt that his experience in my country left an indelible mark in him. Though he spent only a few years in Mexico, these were profoundly meaningful. In 1945, he managed to get a place at Wagner College, being awarded his first degree in the social sciences 3 years later. He then went back to Europe, and after attempting to make a life in Israel, he and his family settled in Vienna. As a result of living in the bosom of a family where Marxist politics and history were the stuff of everyday conversation, as a boy he became steeped in these themes, which played a decisive role in his decision to become an historian and his connection with Mexico, so that in 1954 he earned his first doctorate in the University of Vienna with a dissertation on the Aztec socioeconomical relations in the 15th and 16th century, returning to the East Berlin only 2 years later to earn a second doctorate in 1962 with a research paper on German imperialism in Mexico. As a child, Katz heard stories about landlords, tradesmen, villagers, and craftsmen, and about the persecution of the Jews and the pogroms, being influenced by the cultural heritage of his grandfather, Jacob, who was an Orthodox Jew, and also by the unwavering communist conviction of his parents, notwithstanding which, as a mature, sensible man, he felt impelled, after the Soviet occupation in Czechoslovakia, to leave this world with which he no longer identified, and in 1970 immigrated to the United States with his family, going first to the University of Texas in Austin and subsequently in 1971 to the University of Chicago. Just 2 years ago, while chatting with Friedrich about the unification of Germany and the opening up to the public of East Germany's secret archives, especially the Stasi ones, I asked him if he was keen to get a look at the files on himself. His reply gave me further proof of his generosity and humanitarian nature. He said no. because at this point, I don't want to come across the names of informants whom I had always considered to be my friends. In the 1960s, after Katz had embarked on his love affair with the Mexican Revolution and Pancho Villa, his admiration for the latter personality, who was so diametrically opposed to his own professional persona, being a veritable mystery, one morning he turned up looking like a very sui generis Inspector Poirot at the little office I had in the National Anthropology Museum, from which I oversaw the Oral History Sound Archive, and in that soft, gentle tone that was so characteristic of him, suggested that we should start retrieving the testimonies of the old villistas. With typical generosity, he immediately agreed to be the advisor for a project that was to become a sine qua non for any understanding of the other revolution. From that moment on, I asked myself a series of questions that I have still been unable to answer, or at least answer partially. What could have led this person, who lived in Mexico when he was an adolescent and whose first interest was in writing a history of the Aztecs, to develop an interest in Villa? How could such a quiet, tranquil man, a professor in the fullest sense of the word, have taken the challenge of uncovering the complex interests of the Germans, the French, and Americans, turning all this into his own secret war, which he fought using the basic weapons of his proficiency in the various languages that were requisite in order to rummage through European archives, and ultimately producing as the spoils of his victory what today is a classical source for those wishing to study the history of the 20th century? How could this same man have had the courage to sail against the wind in order to gain an understanding of Villa and end up being captivated by this mustachioed bandit, the barbarian of the North, kept the constitutionalist forces in check, the persons who defy the great power of the Mexican North, while at the same time playing a significant role in the triumph of the Mexican Revolution? Over the years, in essays, interviews, conferences, and finally his book, The Life and Times of Pancho Villa, monumental both in size and content, he did not pass over, much less evade, the problems inherent in such research. Then, as now, it was a matter of getting one's teeth into a historical figure, a legend, a myth, who was undeniably complex. Villa left no archives or direct testimony other than the diary that he dictated to Trillo of his ideological leanings. The adjectives were evasive, making the task of propounding categories such as bourgeois, revolutionary, or revolutionary peasant a slippery one, so that it was hard to pigeonhole him. Even so, Katz succeeded without a doubt in showing up the other face of the revolution in his biographical reconstruction of Pancho Villa, a sort of northern Mexican Robin Hood, or fifth horseman of the apocalypse, in his solid, moving portrait of the Villa the man. Perhaps, as an historian, he was not bashful about admitting that the legend had eclipsed the character, who had in turn eclipsed the movement that he led. It was a long journey, a complicated ride through history on horseback, which 75 years later bore prodigious fruit. As in 1998, Pancho Villa can now rest in peace. His epitaph is this great book, the most fitting monument to the figure who had burrowed deep in the collective consciousness. Frederick's endeavor to retrieve tradition and legend in order to create a sketch of his great personage, Villa the revolutionary, Villa the governor, Villa the social reformer, Villa the guerrilla fighter, and paradoxically, Villa the latter-day landowner, was totally successful. As a result of enormous effort, he was able to put him into the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that was Villismo, beginning, performance, and Villa the outlaw, passing on to the revolutionary and national leader, and then to the guerrilla fighter, before finally recreating those last years which he defined as ones of reconciliation, peace, and death. And as we could go on, I have come to the conclusion, perhaps more concordant with popular rather than analytical psychology, that the eternal child inside Katz, who had a subtle for highly offbeat sense of humor and tackled intractable topics such as espionage and banditry with ease fulfill his unceasing need to play. Without a doubt, the need that he felt, on the other hand, to peer into the dark recesses of history was balanced, on the other hand, by his ceaseless endeavor to understand those whose nobody understands, those with no history. He's effort to judge them fairly by putting himself in their shoes, and even to be an accomplice and participant in a permanent uprising against a convenient history that is engraved on brass, an official history, if you will, which those who govern Mexico have ceaselessly defended and will continue to defend, no matter which faction or party they belong to. I am sure that Katz had an enormous heart, every nook and cranny of which was filled at all times with love for Mexico, a fondness which in large measure stemmed at the bottom from his understanding of the Mexican countryside and the Mexican peasants, or the even changing patterns of the latter life and the complicated nature of his development. Only thus can I explain how he managed to comprehend, analyze, and explain us Mexicans, to understand the motives that cause a people to rebel, fight, and make its own distinctive mark in the revolutionary struggle, turning it, in a sense, into an expression of the defiance of those who are ruthless and dispossessed, while not forgetting the never-ending impertinent meddling of the United States. It is clear that Katz always had a predilection for Mexican topics such as the peasantry, land ownership, peasant and indigenous uprising, the complex relation between Mexico and the United States, and undoubtedly the strange, piercing state of imperialism, be it British, American, or German, or even French and Japanese, since for him the revolution was an international affair, and as he accurately affirmed, a fratricidal, heart-rending civil war was fought on Mexico's soil, while abroad there was a secret, recondite, joking for position, a struggle to get a piece of the action and profit from the first great revolution of the 20th century, our revolution. Very early on, he acknowledged, insisted, and sustained that there was not just one, but many revolutionary struggles taking diverse forms in different regions, so that the leaders who headed the various movements proposed different changes and reforms depending on the conditions in each part of the country and the social makeup, needs, and manifold backgrounds of their inhabitants. By 1962, he had published an initial essay entitled Germany and the Francisco Villa, which preceded his doctoral thesis entitled Deutschland, Dias und die Mexikanische Revolution at the University of Berlin. In one interview, he asserted that Villa had interested him, and I quote, precisely because of the complex issues surrounding both his personality and his movement. When I look into the matter further, I encounter fascinating new questions such as, how could a semi-literate laborer and bandit like Villa managed to put together an army of 30,000 men, govern Chihuahua, one of the biggest, most developed Mexican states, and at one and the same time acquire such enormous popularity nationwide, and at least from 1913 to 1914 also managed to be highly respected in the neighboring United States. He went on to conclude that the Villista movement was something unique in the history of Mexico and also in that of Latin America. The regions where it sprang up, Chihuahua and Durango, were frontier zones where the peasants, most of whom were gathered together in military settlements, had fought back Apache raids for almost 2 centuries and were privileged compared with the rural populations of central Mexico. The peasants in the north had won a measure of autonomy that was unwanted and in the other parts of the country, and due to the abundance of available land, were much richer than their counterparts in the center of the country. Villa's revolution was essentially an attempt to regain freedom and well-being. Hence, Katz concluded that the Centaur of the North remains a controversial character who is, even today, spurs debate and readily acknowledged that the legend had eclipsed the person, who had in turn eclipsed the movement that he had headed, and thus that he enabled us to make inroads into the life and times of Pancho Villa. In his long gallop through the history of Mexico, Katz managed to assemble a solid fighting force, not to say a veritable northern division, División del Norte, consisting of his pupils, friends, and colleagues who, over several decades, explored and shared with him both private and public archives. All of them, without exception, have been joyful participants in the Katzian adventure of getting to know Mexico and understanding it. He was always there for everybody, and especially for me. When you needed him, I remember him always loaded up with notes and documents, which he carried in that much scuff, much travel, all-leather briefcase that I found so quaint. On countless occasions, I stood in for Yana, either straightening his tie, to which he was totally oblivious, or smoothing out the ever recalcitrant and rebellious tips of his shirt collar, which incessantly crept upward, balking at the rigors of property as I searched for the retaining buttons that had sunk deep into the recesses of the always well-starched and immaculately ironed collars. Friedrich Katz was, and continues to be, an unfailing example of steadfastness, courage, commitment, and trueness to self. He was beyond a shadow of doubt a generous man, a generous person in the extreme, an extraordinary teacher and guide, and even more, an unfailing friend. He was a truly good man, or as our grandparents would say, a true Mensch, i.e., an upright, honorable person, someone possessing strength of character, rectitude, and a sense of duty. More precisely, the word Mensch, which the dictionary defines as a noun derived from German and Yiddish, originally meant person, son of Adam, but has come to mean a responsible, dignified human being with admirable characters such as fortitude and firmness of purpose, who radiates fundamental decency. Friedrich Katz embodies this Yiddish appellative. He was and will always be remembered as a Mensch. Here today, together with Jana, Leo, Jackie, Benjamin, Miriam, Tessie, and Amanda, Richard, and Claire, I miss him and I remember him. Thank you.
I believe that Friedrich would have liked a discussion of this quite remarkable book. But at the same time, all of us want to talk about Friedrich. I'll try to reconcile both of these desires with a few scattered comments. The desire to talk about Friedrich and to talk about the book is actually not very difficult to reconcile, because the richness of this remarkable Festschrift is in the end a reflection of various aspects of the personality of the man who inspired it. Specifically, why is this a remarkable Festschrift? First, the breadth and scope of the work speak to the influence of the figure, which was truly unique in the field of Mexican modern history. I don't believe that there's anyone else who could have brought together this assembly of historians and writers in a Festschrift. Second, the warmth of the contributions, which signals that Friedrich touched many, many people personally and not only intellectually. Third, the seriousness that each individual contribution demonstrates, which without a doubt signals to me that each one of us who contributed wanted always to be seen kind of in the intellectual equivalent of their Sunday best when it came to being in Friedrich's company. And finally, I have to say that the book which is a valuable scientific contribution, which I don't think most Festschrifts are, I have to say, reflects something which I think we've heard in all of the remarks so far, which is that Friedrich's influence in Mexico is really just hard to fathom and hard to exaggerate. I was in Mexico this last week. I just came back on Monday, and as some of you know, November 1st and 2nd in Mexico is the day, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, the Days of the Dead, and I was surprised to hear that, for example, about the depth of Friedrich's spheres of circulation, surprising spheres of circulation, that in the school of my nephews, that is a grade school, the Bartolomé Cosío, which is a school that was founded by Spanish refugees, there were several photographs of Friedrich Katz put up by parents and teachers at the altar of the Days of the Dead. And none of these parents, I found out, knew Friedrich personally. That is, they put him there because of his work, period. I mean, that's it. At the Colegio Michoacán, a friend of mine, a former student of ours, of Friedrich and mine, who isn't here today, Paul Liffman, who's now a professor there, sent me a couple of photos of an altar of the Days of the Dead that they put up at the Colegio Michoacán. They put up one every year, and it had two photos, one of Friedrich and another of Carlos Monsiváis, who also passed away very recently this year. Well, Carlos Monsiváis is, I think, arguably Mexico's most prominent public intellectual, period. I don't think there is another one that is as sort of well-loved and as widely read and known. And there's Friedrich side by side in exactly the same structural position. I think that this speaks to something that is really quite unique, and that's what we're in front of, and it's very hard to explain, and I couldn't explain it, I won't try. I was asked by Emilio Curi and Javier Garcia Diego to refer in my comments today especially to the section of the book that is about exile. It's made up of 15 serious scientific articles that range from historical accounts of the experiences of Mexican exiles abroad, mostly in the US, sometimes in Cuba, sometimes in Europe, during the Porfiriato first, that is, the first wave of Mexican exiles were usually of the left, of the Jacobin left, then exiles of the revolution, which came in various kinds of waves, some of them of the left, some of them of the right, some of them of this left, some of them of that left, of this right, and of that other right, of the 1920s, where you also had Cristero Catholic refugees, refugees from the left, refugees from the right. So you have about 20 years of Mexican refugees going outside of Mexico, and then from the 20s forward, a series of exiles coming into Mexico that are described by these various historians who contribute to the section of the book. We're talking here about American, quote, slackers who were fleeing the draft and the Red Scare in the end of the First World War. We're talking about Central and South American exiles, people like Sandino, people like Aya de la Torre from Peru. We're talking about the Spanish exiles from the Civil War, the 1930s, the European exiles from the Second War, which include such prominent people like Enrique Semo and Friedrich himself. And more recently, Chilean exiles, Argentine exiles, Central American exiles, Uruguayan exiles. The impact of these histories, tracked in this book, as a collection, is that they demonstrate in a subtle and quiet way that Mexico's 20th century was shaped by exile. This important point that I think Friedrich is probably the person who has seen this most clearly, first and foremost. First, the exile of Mexicans, of the right and of the left, the experiences of exile here in the United States, in Cuba, and elsewhere. And then by Mexico as a place that received exiles, exiles who contributed to shaping Mexico in the imagination. Friedrich was one of these exiles, and he had the peculiarity of writing a history of Mexico that decentered the national narrative as only an exile can do, showing consistently, which could be to some possibly irritating or baffling, showing consistently similarities between Mexico and other places of the world. The reason why I say that this is irritating is because in Mexico there has been a kind of fondness for Mexican exceptionalism, just like in the US. Only Mexico, only this in Mexico, only that in Mexico. And then Friedrich kind of, in his mild-mannered way, would all of a sudden remind you that, well, you know, yes, it's true, but Poland, blah, 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 and Ireland, X and Y. And in fact, it's not so different from what happened in Peru, and etc. So Mexican exceptionalism, for anyone who cared to listen, was dead in the water. He showed that, I was saying, consistently similarities between Mexico and other places in the world, looking for international connections, and demonstrating their significance even for the keystone event of Mexico's modern history, which is its social revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. In this sense, Friedrich's book, The Secret War, which I believe was the work that generated a paradigmatic shift in modern Mexican history, is not the work of a normal diplomatic historian, one that tends to take the perspective of one or another nation in her explanation of an international connection. That is, most diplomatic historians start from a national identity. So they're talking about U.S.-Mexican relations, and they're writing as an American or as a Mexican. They're talking about the relationship between Mexico and Britain, and they're writing this from a Mexican point of view, etc. Instead, the whole field of international relations and the regional history of the border are synthesized in Friedrich's work, bringing together diplomatic, social, and political history in a way that I think only an exile could hope to accomplish. That is, there is no privileged identification in this work of Friedrich's, and this lack of privileged identification makes this work, which is apparently a work of diplomatic history, a work that actually kind of takes the whole narrative of the Mexican Revolution off center, or actually puts it in center, I would say. The Festschrift for Friedrich, this volume, in its section on exile, takes off from this grand foundation and explores specific exiles, exilios, that is, experiences of exile, one after another, linking the experiences of collectivities to a world of international relations and to the social history of specific places, Mexico City, San Antonio, Los Angeles, El Paso, Havana. And the result is a view of Mexican history which is much truer to fact than the intensely nationalist version that wants the alpha and omega of the nation's sense to lie in its deep historical roots. Mexican history has been a history of movement. This is a basic thing in Friedrich's work. With its provinces, its peasantries, its traditional provincial middle classes, its old-fashioned oligarchies, and its modernizing agents, all of this is true. All of this kind of provincial, more or less deep Mexico is there. But nonetheless, it is a history of movement, a deeply international history. The fact that 15 historians, most of whom are working in Mexico, have been doing this work attests to deep influence on the part of Katz, an influence that trespasses knee-jerk national history softly, but in a penetrating manner, and in a way that has changed modern Mexican history. And now, to Friedrich's own exiles, because I don't want to concentrate exclusively on the book. Mexican historians, it seems to me, generally emphasize only one of Friedrich's exiles. That is, his exile from Europe before the outbreak of the Second War. This exile in Mexico City was one of a number of, almost a palimpsest of exiles that occupied Mexico City and that made Mexico City probably the kind of cosmopolitan city, certainly for various left exiles of the continent, alongside Buenos Aires, alongside the city here, Philadelphia a little bit, but probably Mexico City was the place that received most people. It's also true, though, that alongside this, what I imagine, because I didn't live it the way Enrique Semo just described, what I imagine is a kind of bohemian exile of sorts. Foreign colonies in Mexico City tended to conform rather insular and quite chauvinistic communities. In Mexico, Friedrich experienced the sense of the absurd in connection to these communities. He couldn't attend the German school there because it was quite literally a fascist bastion, which was eventually closed down because of its, its relations to Nazi Germany, and attended the Liceo Franco-Mexicano. But at the Liceo Franco-Mexicano, he learned about nos ancêtres les Gaulois, and observed that while its students, his colleagues, his fellow students ruminated on their connection to Vercingetorix and whipping the Romans at the Battle of Gergovia, they seemed to be oblivious to the country that was around them. The majority, that is Mexicans, the people who were outside the walls of the Liceo Franco-Mexicano, were, for this community, a minority. And Friedrich took up the minority cause with a passion, attending eventually Mexico's National School of Anthropology and studying under people like Pablo Martínez del Río, who was kind of ex-hacendado, and about whom he always spoke quite well. I think Friedrich did, although with a certain smile on occasion. Vigberto Jiménez Moreno, historians and anthropologists of the old school, okay? People who looked at baskets and, little pieces of, I don't know whether you know what I'm talking about, but, this is really the old school. I mean, this is people who looked at jugs and pieces of clay. This is my way of summarizing the field of archaeology. But he also befriended fellow exiles from the European left, Enrique Semo, the Stavenhagens, people who would become key figures of Latin American social science and Latin American thought. So he had those roots as well. It belonged to a generation that really rethought Latin America and had a deep impact in social thought from Latin America. So there is here, I think, the experience of the fragmented qualities of exile that help generate the decentered and multiple perspectives that made so many people find a place in Friedrich and in Friedrich's interests and concerns. There's also a second exile, though, that's less commonly discussed because it was in many ways more ambiguous and more complex, sometimes maybe perhaps a little less heroic. And I'm referring here to Friedrich's exile in this country, in the United States. Here, Friedrich belonged to a smaller group, since former communists were screened quite rigorously before being admitted to the United States. In this country, Friedrich can be regarded as a late arrival from the pre-war refugees of Nazism, but with an exception, and that exception is his Latin American experience on one hand, and his experience in the GDR on the other. Two experiences that gave him a kind of breadth and peace, I would say. At least this is the Friedrich that I met. I didn't have the privilege of knowing him quite as far back. That was a true rarity. There are ways in which Friedrich's background, experiences, and sensibilities can be compared to two other immense figures that were his contemporaries, Eric Wolf and Eric Hobsbawm, two Erics, both of whom were also Viennese Jews. Hobsbawm, of course, is still alive, so he still is a Viennese Jew, I suppose, English, I guess, and both of whom shared in his world historical sensibility. Friedrich's American exile was also filled with a kind of intense irony regarding the limits on the usual blather about identity. Once I remember when I arrived, not when I arrived, but at some point in Chicago, Friedrich and I were also colleagues and worked, were very close colleagues. So once he told me a story about his early arrival in Hyde Park when he ran a stop sign and was stopped by a policeman. An African-American policeman comes out of the car. Friedrich, of course, has been living in the GDR for a long time. The presence of police is not necessarily peaceful, and I don't think that his passage through Mexico made him any easier on the score of friendly connections to the police. So the policeman walks up, asks him for his license, and the Katzes had lived, I think, for a year or maybe a little less in Austin before moving to Chicago. So Friedrich had a Texan driver's license. The policeman looks at the driver's license and sort of grins and says, don't worry about it this time. We Texans have to stick together. And so, and this story was told always by Friedrich with this just vague little grin. Is his comment on the power of identity. We Texans must stick together. So, at the same time, I think that alongside this, I think sense of humor regarding the craziness that surrounds us and around identity and the like, he appreciated deeply the democracy of the American university system. which he found exemplary in comparison to the European university system, as well as to the Latin American university system. And he managed to use the liberty that he found here in a quite original way, that is, developing a teaching style that was entirely European, research-based, absolutely research-based, in what turned out to be a peculiarly fertile and I think somewhat exceptional American context, which was the University of Chicago, that seemed to have a space for that. I was going to say thank God, etc. I don't know whether Friedrich would like that. And he was able, in that framework, again to bring Mexico into focus, but this time from the United States. And he used the many resources that he had to bring Mexican scholars here and to help them see Mexico from this vantage point, and with the resources that are available here. All of this is evident, abundantly clear in this Festschrift. The Mexican scholars who contribute are closely familiar with American resources, scholarship, and points of view, while retaining their own sense of irony with regard to this subject position. In short, it fell to Friedrich and to his generation, to scholars like John Womack, Richard Morris, and Tulio Alperin, for instance, to create a new modern Latin American history in this country, and to transform Latin American history in Latin America through this connection to this country. The result of these numerous transgressions, very strangely, was produced a kind of, or generated, I think, around him a sense of trust. Many, many people trusted Friedrich. Academics, social activists, presidents even, which is bizarre, and ministers, or presidential candidates, even more bizarre. But also graduate students, departmental secretaries, staff. A quarter of the book that has been dedicated to Friedrich is about exile. Like a modern-day Oedipus myth, it is perhaps the case that this book suggests that it is only from exile that one can truly see. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these wonderful speeches and evocations of my father's work. I have to say something more about the fragmented experiences of exile that Claudio mentioned, because this really rings a bell for me because of many things that my father told me. When my father arrived in Mexico, he arrived at the age of 13 in 1940, and he found himself in a number of overlapping exile communities. His father in particular found himself in a number of overlapping exile communities, in each of which he had some sort of place. So there was, on the one hand, the group of German writers that found refuge in Mexico, and people like Anna Seghers, Ludwig Renn, Bodo Use, and who founded actually a German publishing house, Libro Libre, and published a lot of important novels in German in Mexico. And Heinrich Mann published one of his novels there. And so he was part of, on the one hand, of my father's father, that is, Leo Katz, who was a writer, was part of this German expatriate writers community. And at the same time, a little bit off-center in that community, because he was, after all, not German, he was Austrian. And, and together with Egon Erwin Kisch and others who felt that they didn't want to be all grouped together as being more or less of the same nationality. After all, it mattered a great deal to them as Austrians after the Anschluss and the invasion of Austria by Germany, that there was a meaningful difference between Austria and Germany and between the different literary traditions. So already he was a little bit off-center within that community, the community of German-speaking writers. But my grandfather also had a presence in the Jewish refugee community, writing for the Yiddish press in Mexico. So he was a member of that very different diaspora. And he had strong connections with a group of Spanish Civil War refugees, because my grandfather helped run arms to Spain during the Spanish Civil War and was close to many of the Spanish Civil War refugees who had found a home in Mexico. And so that was another community with whom my grandfather and my father had very strong relationships. And then, of course, my father went, on the other hand, to this Liceo Franco-Mexicano, which was a completely separate world of French expatriates in Mexico. And then he, so in all of these different identities, he was more or less jostled back and forth. What emerged from him above all was the love of Mexico, Mexican history, and the love of the country that had received him and his family, and that had saved their lives, and that had accepted so many different people and so many different refugees from so many different communities. I should mention one humorous aspect, too, of this fragmented existence in exile, which is that in Mexico, of course, there was another German-speaking community larger than the group of German-speaking writers, and very different, namely a German nationalist community that was very heavily pro-Nazi, very much influenced by the Nazi regime. And this was, of course, entirely separate from the community of German-speaking refugees. There was very little contact, as you can imagine, between the two, except on one occasion, which had to do with my grandfather, Leo Katz. Leo Katz, who was a journalist as well as a writer, managed a bit of a coup when he got a hold of the subscriber list of the German national newspaper, which was published in German for the German community, expatriate community in Mexico, very heavily in a community from engineers working in the oil industry, so very different community than the German exiles and the Jewish refugees, reading their own German nationalist newspaper. And once he got a hold of the subscriber list, he and I believe Egon Erwin Kish together created a facsimile, a completely false, fictitious special edition of this newspaper with the letterhead, the logo, the typeface, and impersonating apparently very accurately the somewhat ponderous nationalist tone of this German newspaper, and published in the name of various made-up aristocratic names a series of articles and op-ed pieces, doubts about the justness of our cause. We finally can remain silent no longer about where the Fuhrer is leading the German people. All written from within seemingly from within the community, raising doubts within the literary style that was common to that newspaper, and sending it out to all the subscribers, since he had obtained the subscriber list, as a special edition of that newspaper, causing a huge confusion and consternation among the readers, an inundation of calls to the German embassy in Mexico, which had to issue a special communique denouncing correctly that this was the work of communist Jewish infiltrators. So I couldn't agree more with the observation that Claudia made about the fragmented nature of the exile experience that my father and his family had in Mexico, which I think only reinforced his turn away from these fragmented identities towards the discovery of the country itself and its history and its people. Now, the book here that we're honoring here today commemorates not only my father's work, but his special love for Mexico, his patria adoptiva, the country that welcomed him and his family, that saved their lives, that gave them a home. And it was and I want to point out particularly an interesting contrast and irony between the relationship that he wound up having to Mexico and the relationship that his father had to Mexico. His father, after all, arrived in Mexico as a fully formed writer and journalist who already had the topics that were dear to his heart, who was writing about a vanishing world, a world whose remnants were vanishing, namely the Eastern European shtetl at the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is a heavily Yiddish-speaking shtetl at the easternmost part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the years leading up to the First World War, a world that he wanted to recreate even as it was disappearing. And his other my grandfather's other great topic, of course, was great revolutionary cataclysms, like the two that he witnessed firsthand, one of which was World War I, but the other one of which, before World War I, was the Romanian peasant uprising of 1907. Because Leo Katz, my grandfather, grew up in a little town, Sereth, the one that he commemorated in his novels, right across from the Romanian border in the Bukovina. And the searing experience of his life happened when he was 15, and he experienced from the other side of the border, the Romanian peasant uprising, crossed over, observed it firsthand, saw how many people were murdered in the brutal crushing of that uprising. And that became the study of revolutions and the fascination with that revolutions became one of the signal themes in my grandfather's work. So when my grandfather lived in Mexico, he was living in Mexico but writing about Europe, writing about his vanishing world of the shtetl, writing about revolutionary cataclysms, and eventually returned to Austria. But when my father returned to Austria with his parents, what he took with him were his indelible impressions of Mexico, his love of Mexico, his fascination with the history, and he too then wound up having the experience of living in one country and writing about another, except that his was diametrically opposed. He lived in Austria and then in Germany, but wrote about Mexico, and for him the two great topics were first the vanished civilizations of the Aztecs, and the experience of a large civilization that suddenly disappeared, in some ways, I think, echoing his own father's fascination with this disappearing culture whose disappearance he witnessed firsthand. And his other great topic, of course, were revolutionary cataclysms, but in his case, of course, the revolutionary cataclysm of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So for me, there's always been this fascinating similarity between the interests of my grandfather and the interests of my father, even the fact that that each of them wrote about the country that fascinated them from a very, very distant vantage point, which in some ways gave them clarity, in some ways shaped the perspective from which they analyzed the country and analyzed these questions. And so I think Exile and the experience of Exile is very much a part of the topics that fascinated my father and that fascinated my grandfather. I want to very much also mention, though, that his books, it wasn't just that he wrote about revolutions and that revolutions were part of part of his work and part of his teaching, but in some ways they even carried over into the topics of everyday life. So I remember as a child, one of the great treats was always taking a walk with my dad, even if it was just a stroll to nearby Bob's newsstand. It was always, whatever my dad and I did together, it always felt like a special occasion. However small the walk was, or small or large, it was simply a treat by virtue of being together. And one of the things that made it such a treat was that whenever we took these walks, my father would say, I could pick any peasant uprising, civil war, or revolution of my choosing, and he would promise to tell me all about it. So what's wonderful for me to hear is, how how much there was of my father to go around, because as generous as he was with other people, he was always also there for me in every way. Whenever I needed to talk to him, whenever I wanted him, I always wondered how he managed to do it, to be there for me and be there for everyone else without anybody having the sense of coming up short. And I want to thank everybody here for bringing out all these wonderful features of his life, of his work, for helping to recreate and celebrate the life, so that we focus not only what we'll miss, focus not only on the sad event of his passing, but we focus on what needs to be celebrated, which is everything that he gave so many of us and what he will continue to mean to us after his death. And I want to thank very much the organizers here, the Institute for Latin American Studies, the University Seminar, the Katz Center, and particularly John Coatsworth, Emilio Curry, and Javier Garcia Diego for putting together this wonderful program, and for putting together, I want to thank all of the people who put together this wonderful book, which is really a remarkably complex book for anything, but especially for a Festschrift. That is, a book of that length with that many contributions, I think is remarkable as a Festschrift and tribute to my father, and says to me a lot about how many people loved him and cared about him. I want to conclude by reading a letter that my father's assistant, Adriana Vera, asked me to read today. She was this assistant for many years and was always wonderful with him. They got along incredibly well, and she wrote this wonderful tribute to him, which she asked me to read to you today. So if you'll indulge me, I would just like to close with that. It's called En recuerdo de mi querido profesor Katz, Adriana Vera. Distinguida audiencia, quise escribir estas líneas recordando a mi querido profesor Katz en este día tan especial. Primero quiero decir que fue una gran bendición y honor, un regalo de Dios de la vida, el hecho de que lo haya conocido y haber tenido el privilegio de trabajar a su lado y haber podido conocerlo también como amigo, guía, consejero. Y me atrevo a decir también que como un padre y un ángel. Como todos en algún momento tuvo que enfrentar una situación difícil de mi vida, y él siempre estuvo presente con una palabra de ánimo, de motivación, un sabio consejo, con esa sonrisa tan linda que lo caracterizaba. Puedo decir que fue una luz en mi camino y que me ayudó a ser una mejor persona en muchos sentidos, tanto en lo profesional como en lo personal. Las palabras nunca serán suficientes para describirlo. Él siempre será un ejemplo de generosidad, nobleza, sencillez y humildad en medio de la grandeza que él era. Su familia era lo más importante para él, siempre fue un verdadero amigo y hacía su trabajo de historiador con verdadero amor y respeto. Mi querido profesor Katz, por último quiero decirle, porque sé que está escuchando estas palabras, que las cosas ya no serán igual sin usted, pero que aunque ya no lo vea llegar a la oficina con su alegría y buen ánimo, ni lo pueda escuchar, siempre su luz y su esencia los llevaré conmigo, en el corazón y en mis recuerdos. Y sé que desde donde se encuentre seguirá siendo mi ángel y mi amigo. Gracias, muchísimas gracias, mi querido profesor Katz, por todo lo que aprendí y recibí de usted. Que Dios lo bendiga y descanse en paz por siempre. Con todo mi cariño, respeto, admiración y agradecimiento, Adriana Vera.
What an event. and how much my father would have enjoyed it. For a while, I was convinced he could not possibly die before November 4th. So determined was he to attend. And there is this phenomenon, some of you may remember, just before the turn of the millennium, the death rate dropped dramatically, only to resurge in the beginning of January as people held off dying by sheer force of will to make it to December 31st. Alas, it was not to be. What's more, by a tragic turn of fate, he just barely missed seeing the beautiful volume that you produced. It arrived literally hours after his death. All the more reason for us, his family, to let you know how keenly we appreciate your putting this event together. How much it would have meant to him, organized as it is by his fellow academic travelers, the people who outside his family came to mean the most to him, his latter-day comrades in arms, as it were. Until he finally settled in Chicago in 1971, my father led a very peripatetic life. Vienna, Berlin, Paris, New York, Mexico, New York again, Israel, and Vienna again. Those were his way stations before he had even reached the age of 21. This did not, of course, happen by choice. It was the tides of history tossing him this way and that. And for someone with such an early life history, it is tempting to think that it would be miraculous if he'd become something other than a historian. The changes in scene became a little less frenetic over the next 20 years. Vienna, Berlin, Mexico, Austin, Texas, finally Chicago, where he made his home for the remainder of his life. Every family has its repertoire of stories and vignettes by which they mark the way stations in the life of its members. They're not usually all that funny or deep. They survive mostly because they're in some often hard-to-identify way emblematic. This is especially true of those stories by which the older generation tries to tell the younger about those parts of their lives they did not spend together. As we are recalling here my father's life and career, I thought it appropriate to retell some of those vignettes by which we, his nuclear family, came to mark the way stations in his life, especially his early life, which we could only learn about through his intermittent and occasional retelling of it. Although he was born in Vienna, his earliest recollections were from Berlin, where his parents had moved when he was not yet 3. His father, Leo Katz, the man for whom I'm named, having taken a position with the newspaper of the German Communist Party, the Red Flag. Virtually all of his recollections from that time are historically suffused. Standing on the balcony of their Berlin apartment when he was barely 3, he remembered seeing a throng of brown shirts on parade. Not knowing any better, he decided to stretch out his hand in a balled fist, the communist salute, and shout loudly, "Red Front," into the street. His panicked father quickly pulled him back into the apartment, panting and expecting the worst. They were lucky. Nothing did happen, though his not easily scared father's momentary panic was something that was to stay with him forever. As I told you, these aren't funny stories or profound ones. They're just stories that for him and us became somehow evocative and redolent of the aroma of their times. He would recall around the same time hearing his father tell of an episode in which he went to collect unpaid dues from a delinquent party member. On ringing the bell, the door was promptly opened, but lo, by a man in full brown shirt regalia. The erstwhile communist warmly invited my grandfather in, apologized for never canceling his party membership to reflect his new allegiances, and announced that he was hereby formally doing so, inasmuch though, as his membership would not be expiring until midnight, he insisted on paying all the past dues that had accumulated up to that time. And now, he concluded the transaction, let's have a beer together. It will be our last, he said to my grandfather, because today we're still comrades, but tomorrow, Katz, you're a Jew and I'm a German, and I would rather not run into you on the street. The final episode my father recalled from that era is the one that explained their departure from Berlin. It's February 1933, and there's a knock at the door. It's the police, or rather a single policeman. The policeman had with him a sheaf of articles from the Communist Party's daily newspaper, signed by a man named Mouse. We have reason to suspect, he said to my grandfather, that he was the author of those pieces, which indeed he was. He denied steadfastly having written those pieces. His name was Katz, not Mouse. Very convincing. The policeman patiently recorded the denials. After a while, he got up, took the protocol he had recorded, tore it to pieces. I don't believe a word you said, he announced, nor will anyone else. As far as I'm concerned, you weren't at home. But I don't know who will come knocking next. You might not want to be here then. That night, my grandfather took the night train to Paris, and his family followed in short order. There followed several moderately happy years in France, in a boarding school. We have reason to suspect, he said to my grandfather, that he was the author of those pieces, which indeed he was. He denied steadfastly having written those pieces. His name was Katz, not Mouse. Very convincing. The policeman patiently recorded the denials. After a while, he got up, took the protocol he had recorded, tore it to pieces. I don't believe a word you said, he announced, nor will anyone else. As far as I'm concerned, you weren't at home. But I don't know who will come knocking next. You might not want to be here then. That night, my grandfather took the night train to Paris, and his family followed in short order. There followed several moderately happy years in France, in a boarding school. Hearing of a boarding school in this context, you might well be surprised, but it seems this was the norm among party members because children were an inconvenient encumbrance while their parents were fighting the good fight. Alas, before long they had to leave France because of my grandfather's, already alluded to, involvement in smuggling weapons to the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. My father always enjoyed recalling the great ease with which they managed to obtain a visa to the United States. My grandfather was able to point the consular officer to the numerous bank accounts according to which he was a millionaire many times over. In truth, of course, he was dirt poor. Those millions were simply funds that had temporarily been parked in his accounts so as to enable him to buy more illegal weapons for Spain. Thus began what my father forever after remembered as one of the happiest periods in his life, his arrival in New York. He liked everything about it, down to the street toughs who once cornered him and announced in heavily accented English of indeterminate provenance that we real Americans don't like you refugees coming here. And for many years after, he would sing the praises of a magical dining establishment called Horn and Hardart, which he was finally able to take us to in 1968, and which unfortunately did not live up to its billing. Alas, my grandfather's one-time weapons smuggling activities got them kicked out of the United States as well. Not that he was doing any of it while the family was in New York. The Spanish Civil War was over by now. But a new law put my grandfather to the cruel choice of either admitting to actions that might have been crimes under American law or perjuring himself. They found refuge in Mexico, which had opened its doors to the veterans of the Spanish Republic's cause. The disappointment of leaving the United States made this at first a bitter time for my father. One of the earliest moments he recalls from his first months in Mexico was one he found painfully embarrassing even years later. It was a visit they paid to a church that wanted to bid a welcome to the European exiles. The congregation turned out to consist almost exclusively of poor Indios. And what was so painful about that? Well, picture the scene. Here was this congregation of poor Indios. In the front pews sat a group of well-dressed, not visibly malnourished, middle-class refugees introduced to the congregation by its pastor as those poor refugees from Europe. And to top it all off, a collection plate was then passed around for the benefit of those refugees. In time, of course, he warmed to the new environs. It helped that the number of refugees, many of them cultural icons like Ana Zegas and Egon Erwin Kisch, rapidly multiplied, turning Mexico into something of a mecca of German language culture. They founded the legendary Heine Club, as well as the equally legendary El Libro Libre, the leading publisher of German language literature outside of Germany. His own feelings about what was happening are expressed in his keen recollection of a somewhat unusual birthday. Not his birthday, but that of the renowned German-Czech Jewish journalist Kish. I believe it was Kish's 60th birthday, and the Heine Club honored him by putting on one of his plays, based on one of the major journalistic coups of his early career, in which he had revealed that the head of the counter-espionage office of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in the pay of the Tsar. As my father would have it, there was one scene that really brought down the house. I'm not sure it really did bring the house down, but that is how he remembered it. It was a scene in which the night porter of the hotel in which the suspected spy was staying tells the hotel's bellhop that his father must be a real idiot. That's it. That's the scene that brought down the house. Why? Well, probably for no reason more profound than that the night porter was played by my grandfather and the bellhop was played by my father. The war over, my parents' family did what not many Jews had the foolhardiness to do. They returned to Vienna in 1948, where my father pursued a PhD in anthropology with a special focus on Mexico. That was not, of course, all he did. His most enjoyable times had nothing to do with his studies, but with his quasi-political activities, which included touring with a communist student choir. Somehow the idea had made its way around that they were a delegation from the Communist Party there to take charge of the strike. There was, of course, a steep price to pay for such political activities in 1950s Vienna. No German-speaking university would consider him for a position, despite his having written an unusually distinguished dissertation, which was not only promptly ushered into print, but translated into Spanish and republished several times thereafter, received glowing reviews, and exerted a palpable influence on some very prominent other scholars writing about the Aztecs. His dissertation advisor told him very directly that there was only one place to which he would write him a recommendation, the Humboldt University in East Berlin. But getting a position in East Berlin, too, turned out to be fraught with some unexpected obstacles. They had to do with his surname. After initial enthusiasm from the people in charge at Humboldt, he seemed unable to get permission to actually enter the country. When the matter was investigated more closely, the reason turned out to be confusion over whether he was identical with or related to a Trotskyite named Leopold Katz or a defendant in one of the Czech show trials named Otto Katz. There are some interesting footnotes to this confusion of Katz's. When in the early 1980s, the former Social Democratic Chancellor of Austria, Bruno Kreisky, visited Chicago, a common friend of ours, Hans Zeisel, before introducing him to my father, explained that Friedrich Katz used to be a communist, to which Kreisky responded with a sweeping gesture, "Oh, all Katzes used to be communists." Given the confusion between Leopold Katz, Otto Katz, Leo Katz, and Friedrich Katz, he might have had a point. Indeed, more of a point even than he realized. For one of the things I learned when I met my wife, Claire, is that the maiden name of her paternal grandmother, Tessie, the woman for whom my daughter Tessie is named, was Katz. But there's more. Tessie Katz's family was so militantly communist that they refused to come to Tessie's wedding to Hermann Finkelstein because he was the son of an Orthodox rabbi. So stereotypes be damned, I think Bruno Kreisky was onto something. Living in East Germany, of course, required all manner of political compromises, and I marvel at the skillful way with which he struck them. Take the matter of his second book, his first foray into diplomatic history and the relations between Mexico and Germany. Publication was initially vetoed, not on political grounds, but because the subject was considered too exotic. That decision was eventually reversed, in part owing to the intervention of one of the group of former Mexico exiles who are now part of the East German government. But there was a precondition. My father's book ended in 1920. To make it of interest to a broader public, he was to bring it up to the current period. An idea my father detested because aside from the work involved and the absurdity of the idea that this would ever appeal to a broader public, It would require him to get into matters of ideology and politics he was absolutely intent to avoid. He would have had to say things about the role of socialism and the socialist countries in the history of Mexico and Latin America that he didn't really believe. He would have to quote the general secretaries of the East German and the Soviet Communist parties in abundance, and so on. He dealt with the matter in an ever so slightly devious fashion. Once the book had been approved for publication, review of the final product would be limited and focused mostly on whether it said anything that could be considered politically incorrect. What he therefore decided to do was to comply with the request to bring the book up to the present by adding a full page and a half of text, covering the period from 1920 to 1964. He managed to skirt the usual requirement of a lengthy quote from the East German General Secretary or some other high-ranking official by finding a bland, uncontroversial pronouncement by an unknown communist functionary from the Dominican Republic made at a recent peace conference in Mexico to the effect that the progressive people of Latin America were glad that they could count on the friendship and the support of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries in their struggle for greater independence and economic advancement. Not perhaps the kind of quote that one would freely choose to put into the concluding paragraph of one's book, but it did get him past the censor without really having to say anything that would later make him cringe. Inevitably, of course, living in East Germany had an isolating effect, even on so cosmopolitan a man as my father. Notwithstanding his fluency in 4 languages and his habit of reading newspapers by the dozens, there was that iron curtain, not quite cutting him off, thanks to his Austrian passport, but certainly keeping him at a distance from the rest of the world. Just how distant comes across in a story he liked to tell about an airplane ride he took in those days from Vienna, Austria to Prague. Seated next to him was a man who introduced himself as Michael Todd. My father then introduced himself in symmetrical fashion and asked Todd what he did for a living. Todd was a little taken aback. "Haven't you seen Around the World in 80 Days?" he asked my father, who had not. "Well, I made that movie." That did not seem to have the desired impact. He added that he was married to Elizabeth Taylor. Well, that did mean something to my father. So much for my father's isolation and resulting naivete. But the story doesn't quite end there, because in the end, Todd proved to be no less isolated and naive in his own way. What was he doing on this plane, my father wanted to know. Todd explained that he was heading to Moscow for an as yet unscheduled meeting with Nikita Khrushchev to propose a Soviet-American co-production of a movie he had tentatively titled The Crimes of Joseph Stalin. When the plane landed in Prague, it turned out Todd did not have a transit visa. He was unperturbed. "Tell them," he told my father, who was translating from English into German for the benefit of another translator who was translating the German into Czech, "they should just call their bosses in Moscow who will tell them it's all right." I don't think my father gave a literal translation of that request. In any event, Todd never did make it to Moscow, and so I'm afraid that Soviet-American project came to naught. I always enjoyed the characteristic self-deprecation with which my father told this story, fully cognizant that it was an instance of symmetrical cluelessness by the occupants of rival ideological camps. We did, of course, eventually leave the East. The whys and wherefores require no retelling here. When we eventually resettled in Chicago, my father's life took on a considerably calmer cast. They were very good years he spent in Chicago, writing his 2 masterpieces, The Secret War in Mexico and The Life and Times of Pancho Villa. They weren't entirely calm because he still had the adolescence of his children, especially that of his son, to contend with. His son, who kept challenging and harassing him over his evolving political views, which he did not consider evolved enough yet. I remember with keen embarrassment the gloating way in which I drew for him a diagram I had just picked up in my introductory economics course, trying to show him that a union is really just a form of monopoly. With a pained expression in his face, he tried to tell me that maybe that wasn't all there was to unions. But the quiet, kindly reply only further fueled my aggression. It took me a good long while before I was able to see virtue in that style rather than an irritating evasiveness. Others, of course, saw it sooner. At a time I did too, as I did the many virtues which rebellious adolescents are apt to overlook in their parents. One of the more touching condolences I received after his death was an email from Hannah Kasper in which she quoted the opening line of a poem of Bertolt Brecht that I did not know. It's called The Song About the Good People. The good people, it begins. The good people one recognizes by their becoming better as one knows them. How true that is of him. I went on, of course, to check out the entire poem, and there's much else in it that is surprisingly true of him. But I'll just quote the last line of the Song About the Good People, which rather nicely captures the way he chose to look upon me. Though they do not approve of us as we are, they are in agreement with us nonetheless. That too is him.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie and Leo, and our friends in the panel. Let's just conclude, and then I hope you'll join us for a small reception. I guess the only thing I can say to close this is that although we're all painfully aware that this is an enormous loss, what we've heard today shows that Friedrich Katz is very much alive in the love and in the memories of his family and friends, in his books, which I have no doubt will make him immortal, in this little tribute that we've all put together as a sign of our admiration and affection. And finally, as all of you know, in the Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago, that proudly bears his name and that is fully committed to continuing his tradition of scholarly excellence and international openness. Thank you, all of you, and I hope we have a chance to talk and reminisce more about Friedrich more informally. Thank you very much.